Welcome everyone to Tariff Refunds are just the beginning. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Josh.
Thanks, Amani. Appreciate it. And I guess you're right. Tariff refunds are just the beginning. My name is Josh Chananie. I'm the partner in charge of the consumer products practice at SAX, and I have the privilege of being joined today by two experts, one with a mustache, one who used to have a mustache, but the DeFilippis brothers, they've become great friends. Tremendous in this space, and obviously for the clients on the phone and for the rest of the folks listening, there's a lot that's still happening. I would say if anything, this continues to evolve. I'll be the first one to tell you and to the boys on the panel here, I'm still in shock. I'm still wait. I can't believe the money's flowing. Will more money flow? I got a lot of questions for you guys. We're going to let you kind of run with this. I'm going to interject as we go. But like Amani said, please, we want this to be interactive. You can put questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to all of them. If we can't, we'll certainly answer them post and get back to you. But I want to say two things before we start. One is I really want to thank these guys for jumping on this with me. Like I said, they've been a tremendous resource for myself, for the firm, and probably for many of you on this call as well. So having their expertise is always greatly appreciated. Second, I'm going to say go Knicks, and I'm gonna let Anthony and Nunzio say a quick hello before we jump into it.
Sure. Thanks, Josh, and
You're
thank
welcome.
you to Sachs and everyone for being here. Yeah, Nunzio, I'm Anthony DeFilippis, and Nunzio DeFilippis is my brother and co-CEO, and he is an SOB. And by that, I mean he's a son of a broker, but also a licensed customs broker in his own right. I'm going to warn you, Nunzio knows way too much about tariffs. It's actually terrifying. And yeah, there's going to be lots of puns today, so buckle up. And you're going to benefit from all of his knowledge. We're going to cover the refunds that you may be owed. And the part that I actually think is more interesting is what's next, because as Josh said, this is far from over. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. All right. So first, we're going to start with CAPE and tariff refunds, refund eligibility, and the confusion with DDP Incoterm, what's brewing on Section 301, 232, USMCA, and some practical recommendations for your businesses. And of course, some live Q&A where you get to put Nunzio on the spot. Nunzio, before we dive in, can you give people a 30-second version of how we even got here today?
Sure. So, Josh, as you may know, President Trump's favorite word is tariffs. Actually, I think he said that tariffs could replace taxes, and that's kind of why we're here, right? He loved using IEEPA tariffs, and those are the ones that the Supreme Court struck down in February. I'll take you back to, if you remember, right, when he was kind of on the White House lawn, and he had that, what I like to call like the Family Feud board, right? Before we were prepping for this webinar, Josh, you were mentioning like, are we giving anything away? Well, that day, Trump stood there, and it was like giving tariffs away. He was like, you get 20%, Russia, you get this, and so those tariffs, those were all under IEEPA, right? And then you started sort of seeing iterations of like, oh, if India, you buy Russian oil, there's a tariff there. Canada, you're running some political ad I don't like, tariff. China, fentanyl, tariffs. All of those sat under IEEPA, and that's what was struck down, and that's really what triggered this refund process that is called CAPE, which is what we're in the middle of right now. And as we've been mentioning, though, that isn't the end of the tariff story. In fact, we have lots of kind of new targeted waves and trade actions coming our way. So today, we want to make sure that businesses here understand how to cover and how to recover, what they're owed in terms of refunds, and also just prepared on what's coming next.
Thank you. Okay, so Nunzio, CAPE. I know CBP or Customs loves acronyms. I spewed a bunch of them a little earlier with the agenda. What are we actually talking about here, and how big is this?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's a good place to start. Let's start with the acronym with CAPE, right? CAPE is the Consolidated Administration and Processing of Entries, okay? And CAPE lives in ACE, which is another acronym, which is the Automated Commercial Environment. I'm gonna, Josh, I'll put you a little bit on the spot. Anthony, you can play the game too.
Sure.
Just, and it's total guess, right? How long do you think it took customs to activate ACE? Just your best guess to launch ACE.
What do you think,
Jo-
Ian? I'll
Josh's
piggyback off
age,
of you.
23. 23 years.
Well, okay. So, I mean, most people don't pick that high of a number, but generally, right, it did. It took almost 20 years. They started
Oh,
in
wow.
1994 is when they started planning, rolling out early 2000, and in 2018 is when it became fully operational. Now, when the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, the CIT basically told customs, you got to figure this out, and you got to figure out how you're going to get all this money back, right? So, the CIT basically gave customs 45 days to figure it out. And all of a sudden, customs came up with CAPE, like this system, and they built it in 45 days.
Yeah.
And previously, it took them over 20 years, to roll out ACE. Customs can't typically respond to a letter in
And this is
45.
what, and to that point, Nunzio, this
Yeah.
is what has been so shocking for me, living through the PPP nightmare and then the ERC nightmare that is still, ongoing. The still companies have not gotten money from that program, and it, supposedly ended years ago. The fact that they could create and deliver in 45 days is still, it doesn't feel real to me.
So I share that because my spidey sense, my gut tells me this system has been in the works for a while. I can't see customs creating this fast and working as well as it is. And I share that because CAPE, it wasn't meant for tariff refunds. They were building this thing for audits. They were building this system so that they can ingest a huge amount of data and really, kind of go through the audit. And so, keep that in mind, right? Because obviously you are asking for refunds through this system, which is an audit tool.
I
Okay.
thought I was supposed to be the pessimist. You were supposed to be the optimist.
Well, okay. So the good news is, right, that we're talking about $167 billion here, as we see, right? There's 53 million entries that are tied to those refunds that have to kind of go through CAPE, right? If every importer claims all of their refunds back. So far, and as of May 22nd, that was kind of the last time they released stats. Customs said it was about 20.6 billion that was released. Now the numbers are kind of closer to 30 billions that are and plus interest that are kind of in the pipeline, approved and on the way back.
Okay, Nunzio. Nunzio, so 30 billion already out the door. What's the catch with all the other entries that haven't been approved yet?
Yeah, so I think something here that's bolded on this slide here to look at, the catches is there's 31% that are failing, right? So that's over almost 3.5 million entries that have been hitting errors. And we'll share kind of the details of the most common issues a little bit later. But I want everyone to pay attention to this stat below. Over 4,000 refunds are delayed because there's missing ACH information. So if you're on this webinar and if you only listen to us for 30-second soundbite, listen to this, okay?
Right.
You have to go in. Don't be one of these importers that have a refund of any kind. Maybe it's IEEPA, or maybe there's other refunds sitting there that customs can't deliver to you because they stopped issuing paper checks. They're only doing ACH. So make sure you go in there and you're looking at updating your ACH information.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because this is also consistent with the messaging that the IRS put out, earlier on in tax season about, this is how they're going to distribute refunds from a tax standpoint as well going forward. So it's not just unique to this system.
Yeah.
Awesome. So before Nunzio tells us like what's going on with all these filings, we just want to do a quick poll to kind of understand where everyone is at in this process. Josh, I'm just curious on the tax side. So refunds have always been electronic for how long, or is this just something new? It's only
No, I
electronic.
think it's something new. I think they're
Okay.
trying to get out of the paper business. I think it's from their standpoint, there's probably less, risk of it being stolen or someone stealing it out,
Sure.
fraud, right? Somebody gets a copy of the check. I think this is their attempt to sort of revolutionize a system that's very old and broken. So,
Sure. Sure.
I guess we all need bank accounts at this point. I guess that's the thing. They move very
Okay, so most of
slowly.
okay, so most of the answers are in for the poll. So about a little more than half have already submitted. About 4% are in the process of filing. 23% or a quarter know we should have, but haven't started. And then another 20% didn't know this is available until today. So pretty mixed bag, but it's good to see at least half have already submitted. So with that in mind, I'll end the poll, share those results.
And I guess Nunzio, even maybe as a follow-up question is, and from your standpoint, what you're seeing are the people who are, and I won't call it late to the game, because again, I was just as skeptical as everybody else. Are you finding that these folks were involved early in either selling their claims, right? There was a lot of people out there who were offering money for claims or, became involved in part of some class action lawsuit. You know, are people coming to you and say, "Look, I'm in this lawsuit. Am I not able to file? Do I file? Do I hold tight?" Uh, I don't know how, what the population of people are that are part of those. But I was just curious kind of what you're seeing from your end.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is that most are going after it because they're seeing the success rate of Cape. They're seeing that this is different because now you're not dealing with just customs. You have the CIT and Judge Eaton sitting on top, like really kind of cracking the whip, if you will, to kind of say, where are we? Where's the updates? I want to see how much money is flowing. So I think you're seeing like a lot of this positive momentum, and so many are jumping in. Yeah.
Even if they're attached to a lawsuit already.
Even if they're attached to a lawsuit, some are putting their suits like in the CIT on pause to go and action through Cape because they're seeing, positive results. But I'll also share a little bit later in regards to another appeal that's coming from the government where there's a little bit of a strategy change for everyone to take.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So Nunzio, you said 31% rejection rate. So what's causing these rejections? Is there a scenario where, filing for a refund could actually come back to like backfire or bite you?
Yeah. So yes, real quick, I'll give you like the most common rejection. So one is that there's just like mismatches between the importer of record and who's filing for the claim. And sometimes it could be just from the normal course of action of what happens in a business throughout a year. Like you might have gone through a merger or acquisition, or you have maybe 2 or 3 different companies in your group. So just kind of like that nuance, it has to be the same. The one that's filing for the refund has to match the record of who actually paid the tariff to begin with. There are some that thought that they were owed the tower, they could access the claim, and they bought like DDP, delivered duty paid. So they're like thinking, oh, my vendor charged me for tariff, so I should be able to go into Cape and claim this back. But that's going to get a rejection because again, you're not the importer of record. We're also seeing just kind of like duplicate filings. So sometimes a customs broker is filing and the importer, so that's causing kickouts and errors. There's a lot of like the 99 coding numbers because of all the rapid changes we went through the past year. There's kind of a lot of messiness that exists, and so a lot of those mismatches are causing kind of errors. And the last I would say is if you fall outside of this phase 1. So right now in Cape we're in phase 1, which is any entries that are unliquidated that have IEPA or they've been 80 days past liquidation. But then like more complicated entries that have maybe anti-dumping duties, reconciliation, all of that is supposedly going to be handled in a second phase. So, one thing I'll always say is that you're asking the government for money back, right? And Josh, anytime you ask the government for anything, this on the tax side, like it's the same thing on this side. Don't be sloppy about it, right? So don't
Yeah.
assume that just because you cleared this 2 or 3 months ago that the data is accurate, and that's why kind of we're
Yeah, I think that's a
seeing.
great point. I think your errors only delay the process because they're so behind with processing everything. That gives them leeway and an out that they will take. And people will get notices just like they do on taxes that they need another 90 days, they need another 180 days. And I guess, part of this, and you're probably going to talk about this, is there really is no timeline for when all the money's going to come back, right? I mean, it's
There's one nuanced timeline, which Anthony, I think is the next.
okay.
Yeah. So you're going right into the next slide. That's perfect.
Yeah, so this is this. Yeah, Ninzi, if you don't mind, just kind of take us through this whole process from like entry review to like getting the actual ACH payment.
Yeah. So Customs launched a webinar right before CAPE went live on April 20th, and in that webinar, I got to tell you, like Josh, I walked out of there and they made it sound so easy. And basically, they said, just give us a CSV file with all your entry numbers that have that have IEPA tariffs attached to it, and we'll do the rest, right? And do the rest is what I really wanted to pay attention to, because in my opinion, that means Customs is basically saying that means we're going to audit. Once you give us the entries that you're asking for a refund, we're going to audit. And that's why there is this kind of timeline where they go through. Once you submit that CSV, it pushes the process right into what we call liquidation. So that means Customs is actually doing an audit, pushing all of those entries to this kind of closed and final state. And so something to keep note of is if you wanted to make a change to those entries, if there are anything that needs to be updated, compliance gaps, you need to do that, what we call a post-summary correction, before submitting the claim, because once you put the claim in there, they're just like pushing it right through this process. So timelines, right? An important update that really just happened last Friday. So in this phase one, as I mentioned, you can file anything that has any entries that have been liquidated and 80 days past liquidation. So the Customs basically came back and said, for those that are in what they call final status, which is that 90 days up after liquidation, they basically saying that they don't have the authority to reliquidate those and issue refunds. Right. So they're basically saying we can't give importers those monies back. And so the government filed an appeal, and they're basically asking the CIT not to issue refunds for those that are past that liquidation. So here comes the strategy, important for everyone to know. If you are past that 80-day mark, we are suggesting at this point, file a protest, because you want to reserve your rights to keep those entries from getting into final status until this is figured out. Because once it's in that final, then your only hope is hopefully the government comes to some sort of agreement on how to handle these. So real important now, this just came out Friday, file protests for any entries that are past that 80 days, because you only have 180 days after the date of liquidation to do that. So that's the major takeaway. Also,
And Nunzio, how do you file a protest in that scenario? Because I do think that's a great point. And again, it's a very similar concept to what we see on the tax side as well, right? Is absent you filing that protest, the deadline passes, you're dead to rights. You might as well kiss that money goodbye, or you're going to have to hope for some crazy lawsuit that happens years from now when I'd like to say hopefully we'll all still be alive, but there's never a guarantee. That's
yeah,
you get a better
yeah.
chance of your kids seeing that money than you.
Yeah, so good question. An importer can file protests on their own. They can also, any trade compliance professional, licensed customs brokers, customs attorneys, they can all support with filing these protests. And, that's our recommendation in order to preserve those rights. Also, as money is coming in, there's the refunds aren't coming clean, right? So meaning like you're putting in a submission into CAPE. Let's say it's a $200,000 refund. Maybe you get 30,000, tomorrow. And then in a couple of weeks from now, you get another 20. So they're coming in drips and drops. And so you really need to pay attention to which entry and reconcile which ones. And these reports that we listed here, REB 603 and 613, they will help kind of guide importers to understand which ones are being paid and, make sure that you're keeping track.
So I keep hearing from a lot of people, and again, it's just funny. The math maybe works out this way. It doesn't. I got 10%. Monday I heard someone said I got 20%. I must be rich. I mean, is there any rhyme or reason as to the 10% number or it's specific to lots that they pick off, and
exactly
it's the luck of the lottery at that point.
Yeah, it's pretty random. They are holding that kind of close to the chest, customs, on which ones they're reviewing, that they're considering high risk. Usually high risk are the ones that have like a lot of other tariffs attached to it, like your 232 steel and aluminum, or your FDA, anything that has to do with other government agencies where like the penalties and fine and the bond exposure is higher. That's usually where we're seeing high risk. But in general, customs is keeping that close to the chest in terms of how they're going through the refund process.
That's a good segue actually here. And this is both for like Josh and Nunzio. So someone's getting, they're getting their refund checks. I don't know, the first instinct maybe for some is to spend it or pay out some bonuses to employees. Why maybe want businesses to proceed with caution? And then Josh, from like a tax perspective, what are the implications of these refunds and the interest?
Yeah, that's great. Nunzio, if you want to start out.
You go ahead, Josh. Tax part.
Oh, so we're still very much awaiting guidance, right? Both from an accounting standpoint and a tax standpoint. And there's different reasons, of course, why you would want to kind of fast forward the revenue. And there are certain reasons why you wouldn't, right? So I think a lot of the conversation that I've heard or been a part of is, well, the big automotive companies, right? They all kind of fast forwarded this refund claim. Why would they do that versus why should we not be the most conservative with respect to this? And again, I think you need to think of not only from a tax standpoint, but who's your audience, right? So if I'm a car manufacturer, obviously I'm a public company. Most of them are. I have shareholders. I want to encourage and show positive results. And I also want to come across and say that the receipt of this money is going to drive down the cost of product, right? So there's a tremendous amount of outbound, let's call it marketing, that's associated to it, and just good brand awareness that may or may not have a real tax impact. For the small to medium-sized businesses like most, there's a real impact here, right? So one is the money all yours, right? Because it's one thing to get the money back, but does that money really belong to you, right? I know we're getting paid back with an interest component. Ideally, some will take the position that that's their money. Some will take the position that that belongs in the pot of what goes back as well. So I think until the reconciliations are really done here and you really know what you're going to receive versus what has to, go back down to the customer, I think you've got to be very conservative with how you report this information. Because, look, the last thing, I understand wanting to show the revenue, right? But if you're an accrual basis taxpayer, you're also fast forwarding that revenue and you're going to volunteer to pay tax on it, right? Cash basis, if you're a cash basis taxpayer, at least you have the ability to delay that tax until you actually receive it. And again, just because you receive it doesn't mean that the responsibility is all yours. Like we were saying before, you still have to reconcile as to whether or not you get to actually keep that money or put it back. But I know, again, a lot of people have different opinions on it. The public companies took one, people who want to show positive results are going to take another. Look, the fact is we're in June, the refunds are coming. So people are going to lean on that and say, well, look, the money's coming. But 10% has come or 20% has come, so it's not there in full boat yet where I would really feel 100% comfortable, thinking that we're going to recognize 100% of it. But again, I think it depends on your situation, right? Some are going to want to show the bank that that they're going to get income back, or, they still want to go to market and they want to show better margins, right? Because ideally the receipt of the refund is going to reduce your cost of goods sold. You're not going to capitalize it back into inventory. So I think there's a whole presentation discussion around that as well. But I think it's specific to your own individual situation. And again, I would always err on the side of being conservative.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than reserve. I agree with that. Like reserve parts of these refunds from a tariff perspective, and we'll get into it really soon here. There's a lot on the horizon that's potentially coming back on and getting turned back on. So I kind of like would put these aside and get ready for your future tariff exposure, future even like freight rates going up. You have fuel, obviously, because of the conflict in the Middle East. So there's a lot of kind of variables that are pushing costs in general up in supply chain. So yeah, I would keep that in the savings account because I think you're gonna need it.
And then I think the only other thing that, is you think about this reconciliation, and maybe you're going to touch on it a little bit later, is, a lot of people wanted to be transparent in their invoicing of their customers as they were passing along the tariffs, versus some just saying, look, it's just a general price increase, right? It was an opportunity, whether we got stuck with the huge tariff or a small tariff. But again, being out in front of the increase in gas and everything else, there was a lot of companies that just arbitrarily raised prices. Now, the customers assumed part of that was a tariff, but it was never identified what piece. Right. So when we talk about unwinding the transactions and understanding the contracts with customers and where the liability may be associated, that's the next shoe to fall in all of this.
Yes, fun stuff.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah. I always said before they even said the Supreme Court declared these unconstitutional, I was always, but where does the buck stop with these refunds? It's really hard to say. And, is it the buyers? What about the consumer? So yeah, it's definitely complicated.
And I still have a question as to where's the money coming from, right? Like there's some schools of thought that say it's sitting in a bank account somewhere. I don't believe that. So I don't know if you guys know where this cash is located. Maybe it's up in this cloud thing they talk about, but I don't believe it.
So let's just move into the DDP challenges. And so Nunzio, sometimes it seems like it's a little unfair. You've heard that the person maybe paying for the tariff isn't necessarily getting the refund, which obviously seems unfair. So how does this play out with DDP shipments?
Yeah, so this is kind of what Josh was referring to, but it's a similar kind of just different parts of the supply chain. So throughout this process last year when the IEEPA was turned on, right, the first thing many importers did is they went to their suppliers and were like, hey, you just saw Trump put on these massive tariff bills. You need to lower your prices, right? And so there was a lot of negotiation going on to a point that it put a lot of pressure on the suppliers. And they kind of said, you know what? How about we give you a price that includes the tariffs, this delivered duty paid? And so there was a pretty massive shift to this Incoterm. So what happens in that case? The importer of record actually becomes your supplier, right? And the shipper. Fast forward to tariffs becoming refundable and the IEEPA becoming illegal. Now they're the ones, those suppliers that have the rights, to the refunds, unfortunately. And so this is the conversation that Josh is talking about, that a lot of buyers are having with their suppliers and saying, well, you kind of charged me inadvertently. How do I want to get some of my, money back? And really we're saying here, there's probably 4 options you have, right? In these are more business conversations. So obviously one is make sure you're having the conversation, right? If you bought DDP and you haven't, knock on the door to your suppliers and try, because they're getting monies back. And if they haven't yet, then maybe you want to just share that they do have this opportunity. And that might also help you to get involved in some of where that refund goes.
And to that point, Nunzio, let me ask you this question, right? So again, we're talking about business. We like to think everybody is reasonable and, it does the right thing. But what's to prevent me from just saying, oh, we didn't file? I mean, the information's not public, correct? I mean,
Correct.
it's, or at least to this point where,
It's not public. Yeah.
How would you know?
They're the importer of record. You're great point. You wouldn't know. If they want to straight up and make up and say that they didn't do it, even though they did, you wouldn't know. Which which is why like it's harder now retroactively to do this, right? To kind of go back and ask them like, oh, let's do a refund sharing agreement. If you didn't file, maybe you push them to be like, hey, I know people who can help you file. Let's get some of this back. Why not filing, right? Why wouldn't you file? And so you can try to kind of have that conversation. Easier said than done. So I think most importantly here is that last bolded, bullet that we have is this is probably not the last time this is happening in terms of refunds. So in your contracts moving forward, when you're opening up new POs with your suppliers, I would strongly recommend creating an amendment, a terms and conditions around future tariff events, future tariff refund events, right? So that you can basically pre-negotiate this saying, hey, if this, I'll agree to buy delivered duty paid, but if this comes back, I want X or whatever. So I think that's the big learning here is to moving forward, make sure you include these in your contracts.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. So let's talk about like what's still at play, Nunzio. So for people who thought this tariff drama was over with the Supreme Court ruling, I hate to break it to them, but the tariff telenovela seems to continue. So yeah, what is this Section 122 all about?
And
Yeah,
just
so
maybe and just maybe even to that point, Nunzio, can you just clarify what the Supreme Court actually ruled, right? Because there's some people who say, well, they said the tariffs are illegal, and that's not the truth.
well, they said the IEEPA tariffs are illegal, and Trump can't use that, and he liked that because it was like tariffs like a light switch. You could turn them on and off day by day as he was doing. Tomorrow, 25%. I changed my mind, 15%. There are other statutes which we'll get to that, especially Section 301, that are tried and tested and will hold up, right? So 122, this is that. So this is what the Supreme Court said. IEEPA tariffs are illegal. Same day, government came out and said, all right, 122 tariffs, 10% global tariff on everyone, and 122 could last up to 150 days. Well, there's cracks in this statute as well. And so lawsuits were filed. And ultimately, the CIT on May 7th ruled even these illegal, right? So there's a potential that these were going to come back. Same story as the IEEPA. A few days later, a federal circuit said, hold on, we're leaving the tariffs in place until we figure this out, right? And so now the 10%, these 122, they do expire on July 24th, right? And so last week, another battle, there's this battle back and forth again between the government and the court. Like, is it legal? Is it not? My opinion, they're not. I don't think it will hold up. I think this 10% will come back. That being said, Jamison Greer, he's the head of the USTR. He just said last week, he said, well, there's nothing in the 122 statute that says that we can't redo this again and restart it on July 25th. So there is this kind of just, back and forth that's going on right now with this specific statute.
So Josh, actually, it's interesting. You said, where is this money coming from? It's almost like they're funding the refunds with other tariffs, which are deemed illegal for now, to continue funding it until they can get the Section 301 tariffs that are actually will be legal or compliant. Filed.
It's
so
smart.
It's like
you just pay with other people's money, and and the reality is too is tariffs been around forever, right? I mean, some of the people who are new to business, maybe they are not as familiar, but it isn't like they fell from the sky.
Yeah.
They've just been put on steroids through this whole process.
Yeah. So actually, we should go, Anthony, into the 301s now.
Yeah. And before we get into that, we're actually going to launch a poll. So we want to know which of these is keeping you up at night. So Section 301 or 232 expansion, the SAFE Act, end of DDP as we know it today, the last sale valuation bill, USMCA, honestly, all of the above.
Yeah, and this is what we are just talking about. Kind of there's a lot of different. All of these, almost all of these, will create more revenue for customs and the government, and that's what it's which lever are they going to pull? And they're looking at all of these right now.
So let's see, about 70% say honestly all of the above, and then 6% Safe Act and Section 301 about 25%. So just keeping that in mind as we move forward.
Great. Yeah, so let me just talk about kind of the 301s, right? So if you go back just to the State of the Union, right? State of the Union, when Trump addressed the nation, happened a few days after the Supreme Court ruled the IEPA illegal. And Trump looked right into the camera, like real close shot, and he basically pointed at the whole world and he said, don't use this Supreme Court ruling to renegotiate the tariffs that we already came in agreement to, right? And so Section 301, and that's unfair trade practices, that's how he kind of gets back to all of those agreements, right? And so IEPA is out, and Section 301 is now back in, and we're looking at kind of two different investigations. One is this first one that we're showing you here. It's based on industrial overcapacity. And this is when what they're looking at is are governments subsidizing, certain industries? Are they tweaking their and fluctuating their currencies so that they can make their goods more competitive, right, and cheaper to bring into the U.S. And they're zoning in on all of these, China, Vietnam, everything that's listed here. The high risk sectors are the ones that we've talked about here. And then, Anthony, the next slide is the second investigation, right, which is about forced labor enforcement, right? And so if you look at this, it includes 99% of our trading. So basically, the whole world is on notice. The entire world is now under investigations by the USTR. And this one is really hot off the press because just yesterday, the USTR released their findings, right? And they basically said everyone failed to prohibit or enforce bans on goods being produced with forced labor, right? So they are saying and proposing additional tariffs from 10 to 12.5% on pretty much the whole world. China fell into the 12.5%. And for China specifically, these 301 tariffs already exist from Trump's first term. And they survived an administration change. So think about that. That's how you know this is like really, this one sticks. It's not being challenged. Democrats came in, Biden came in after Trump. They kept the 301s. They actually added to them. So this one is the one to probably really watch out and be concerned about. And they're probably going to stack on top of the 301s that currently exist. So since Trump's first term, 301 has really only been attached to China. You're going to see it across the board. The dates to really look at now is on the 22nd of June. There's going to be hearings from the trade, basically. Then there's a process here. That's why the 301 stick, because there's a hearing process. There's comments from the trade, and then the USTR comes out and kind of gives their final notice.
They actually thought that one through.
Yeah. Yes, this one sticks. And then we also have one earlier this week. Brazil has also been on notice, and Brazil is looking at a potential 25%, right? So there's a lot of these popping up, and these are the ones that are really going to replace what we previously were under IEPA.
Got it. All right. And then there's Section 232, Nunzio, so which I think of as like the national security wild card tariff. So what should people be bracing for here?
Yeah, so this one has had like so many iterations, right? So yeah, Section 232, another one that sticks because it's under national security. The main ones that we've seen is under steel and aluminum, but there's auto parts in there as well. And there's a lot, again, under these impacted sectors here. They're looking at the EV markets, obviously the critical minerals, the semiconductors. They're really looking at protecting those industries, and or trying to bring that more domestic. So you're going to continue to see.
Well, this is where a lot of the problems were created during COVID, right? It was everything was it was around the chip shortage, and so this is
Yeah,
not
this is
surprising.
Yeah, this is tactical. This sticks. I'll share that there's been an early, like a quick win here, right? Just recently, last week, it was announced that Taiwan, they negotiated a 15% like cap on 232. So where everyone else is paying like 25%, is a cap, meaning like if they have a product that comes in at 5%, they'll only get a charge an additional 10, where everyone else is 5 plus the 25. And so there are opportunities, again, for negotiation. I'll tell you how they did it. They told the U.S. that they're going to invest $500 billion into the semiconductor market, into AI here. So if you want to see kind of the playbook on how to get tariffs reduced, and that's kind of the playbook to the world, is you have to kind of open up your pocketbook and saying that you're going to bring money here, real money and dollars and investments, and that could open up opportunities.
How soon do you think it will take, or we'll see whether or not this whole concept around the playing field actually being leveled will, look, it's one thing to commit the money. You still have to build the factories. You still have to hire the labor. I mean, this is not a country that's rich with, people who want to go work in factories right now either. So
that's a good question that keeps coming up, is like, you hear all these numbers about the investments that these countries are going to commit. Even like you hear commitments to like buy a bunch of Boeing, let's say, for example, airplanes. But then there's also like Boeing, can't produce all of these. They're already on back order for the next. So like, how do we hold these countries accountable? How do we make sure that these investments actually happen? That's a good question to understand, but that's kind of what Trump is saying. If that doesn't happen, then he is reversing track on some of these or countries, or increasing then tariffs, because he's saying you didn't honor your commitments. So here's what we're doing now, kind of thing.
Sure. Thank you. So DDP, I know we were talking about this a little earlier. It seems to always kind of get a lot of attention, and now we're hearing that it may not be safe, because there's something called the SAFE Act, which sounds either very reassuring or alarming, I guess, depending on where you sit. And so which is it? What's this whole SAFE Act thing about?
Yeah, so DDP, what Customs has uncovered, and as I mentioned before, is many importers switched to this Incoterm because suppliers basically said, we'll take care of the tariff thing. Stop beating me up on my price. I'll figure it out, right? And when I asked many times throughout the past year, CFOs, oh, so what do you think when your supplier gave you this DDP price? Many of them paused, and a lot of silence in the room, I'd say, because a lot of them kind of came back and saying, well, they're kind of saying, I don't believe that they're doing the right thing. He's like, because these CFOs that we talk to, they're pretty sharp. They know the lowest possible landed cost for their product. And if it's below that number, they're like, something's not adding up. And so Customs quickly sees what's not adding up. And there's a lot of tariff evasion, right? There was tax evasion for years. Now tariff evasion is the new thing, and going on in this model. And Customs is very, very in tune and aware. So this bill is proposing for these foreign importer records, like you said before, Josh, to have a bank account here in the U.S. So they're like, even though you're a foreign company, you need to have a U.S. bank account. And oh, by the way, you also need to have U.S. presence. And it can't be a shell company. You have to have real employees. And they're going to increase their bond requirements. So this is all tucked in under this bill to just ensure that Customs has someone to go after when there are compliance gaps, when there is tariff evasion, because right now it's proven to be challenging, where they go after the supplier and then the supplier overseas quickly shuts down the company and reopens up elsewhere, and has kind of Customs, running around like with like a chicken without a head. And again,
Nunzio, to that point, so a lot of folks on the calls are familiar with the IRS will go back 3 years in audit, the states maybe 4 years. Have they put any guardrails with respect, and then PPP and COVID came, and all of a sudden the enforcement period went to 6 years, right? Because they knew they were never going to be able to get to the bottom of everything. Have
Yeah.
they said anything with respect to what a timeline could look like, or kind of how much exposure they're giving themselves?
Yeah, I mean, they can go back 5 years. In addition to that, I mean, Customs has done some really great marketing on this, and oftentimes the ones who know about the tariff evasions are the people who are in the same industry. I've been in rooms, in meetings where there's a pissed off importer who's basically like, my competitor across the street, he's cheating and I know it, right? Because they know who their supplier is, they know the pricing, they know, and Customs is aware of that. So they have basically partnered up with the Department of Justice, the DOJ. They have a whole thing on like webinars where you can go in as an importer and really whistleblow. And their marketing is, we need to protect the ones that are doing it right, the ones that are being compliant, that are playing by the rules. And so there's many importers that are going in there and kind of dropping in who's evading tariffs, and so it is definitely something to keep a watch for.
Okay, thank you. We have one last poll. So before Nunzio walks us through this last sale bill, what is your organization's experience with first sale for export valuation? So either you currently use it, we have evaluated but do not currently use it, we are aware of it but need to learn more, we are not familiar with it.
And Josh, like, first sale is kind of, this is where tariffs become like taxes, where there's kind of there's deductions to look for, there's non-deductible charges, right? There's you're looking at the valuation, so there could be when it comes to tariff mitigation, it could be very impactful. But yeah, it looks like the majority here are not familiar with first sale, and there's no one that actually uses it. I'll just go very high level because I know we only have 10 minutes left, but for first sale, it's basically many import transactions. There is more than one party. And so when you have your US, let's say, buyer or importer, you have a vendor somewhere overseas, and then oftentimes that vendor acts like a sourcing agent or a trading company and manages a bunch of the factories. And so there's like two POs happening. The US buyer is issuing a PO to the vendor is issuing a PO to the suppliers. And in this first sale, you can actually pay duties on the first sale from the factory to the vendor rather than what most importers are doing now. However, this last sale bill is kind of attacking this methodology because tons of importers have shifted to first sale once all these tariffs went up. You have all your big box retailers you have your Home Depots, Targets, TJ, so it's very commonly used, but it's being challenged right now. So this isn't the first time, this is probably the third time in the past 30 years that something has come up where this is being looked at. And when something like this happens, it really just ends up creating more audits from Customs, which is why it's so important to work with a trade professional when you're setting something like this up. So you're kind of just ready. You're ready for that audit.
So I think a lot of times people look at it as they're going to try and outsmart the system, and at some point the system, catches back up to them. But even to that point, we looked at this a couple years ago during COVID when it was all the additional freight costs, everything else added to the tremendous carrying value of the inventory, and people were buying and buying and buying because they were so afraid not to have it, in the event that the customer needed it. That we looked at inventory valuation changes from many companies go from average cost, and we looked at a LIFO because all of that cost was sitting on the inventory that you just acquired. So I think it is important and mindful to understand the costs associated with the lots and when they're coming in and really when they're going to sell, because there is a strategy there.
Yep, for sure.
Great. Thank you both. And then last but not least, USMCA. This is an agreement that was supposed to bring stability to North American trade. And Nunzio, how's that going right now?
Yeah, so it's under negotiation, right? It's going to look different. And I think the main component that's being looked at here, which is not just with USMCA, it's in general, is we're no longer looking at, is this made in China? They're also just looking at how much of the components are coming from China. And we know that Mexico, for example, there is a ton of components that are being funneled from China to Mexico, then final assembly happening. So they're really going to look at those rules, the rule of like the content. And that's, I think, where you're going to see the biggest exposure. So it's prudent on anyone and any importer, and not only Mexico again, but in general, you really need to start digging more and asking more questions from your manufacturers, from who you're buying from. You really need to ask them, where are the components coming from? How much of a percentage, where are they sourcing? Because if China, which probably, if they're a big percentage, if they're a big piece of that pie, you really want to start decoupling that, because that's what the US is after.
How much of that responsibility actually falls on the buyer, right? So, bringing it in, but is the expectation that I really know, or who really gets to the bottom of that?
Yeah, and everything is all under the importer of record, because they're the ones that have to kind of, under this like reasonable care and going through a due diligence process, they need to be knowing where your components are coming, and then coming back even to like the Section 301s, unfair trade investigations. Again, there's a spotlight on just forced labor, so they need to understand like where are the goods really coming from. And it's not, you can't just have like an easy quick documentation trail that says, oh, made in Mexico, and you feel good about it. You need to really kind of
You mean the sticker on the bottom of the product doesn't get you covered?
Yeah, exactly. You need to go much more intense.
Okay, so let me land this plane, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I do want to try to get some questions. So just 5 takeaways here is: 1, CAPE is only in the first phase, and real money is available right now. 2, refund ownership is critical, especially in DDP, and understanding who owns or who gets the refund. 3, we have Section 301, 232, the SAFE Act, the last sale bill. Again, that tariff telenovela is far from over. 4, preserve liquidity. You don't want to blow that refund. And 5, it's really, really important to get procurement, finance, legal, supply chain all in the same room when you're talking about tariffs and planning, because this can't live in like one department siloed anymore. So Nunzio, how does that sound in terms of recommendations? And are we ready to take on some questions?
Yeah, I think I'll just say that we're on this tariff roller coaster ride, and my advice would be like, there's no one needs to ride it alone, right? And so when you're looking at the role of a trusted advisor, right, you have obviously Josh here and SAX, right, trusted partnership, someone that you've had as a partner for many, many years. I would suggest look at your customs brokerage partnership to make sure you're elevating that role to the same regard as you would your CPA, right? Tariffs and taxes are a major part of a cost structure. So really look at that, bring that partnership, as you said, onto the kind of like C-level in those high-level meetings.
Love it. I think that's great.
Great. I have 4 questions here. I think we could get through them pretty quickly. So
yeah, let's crush them.
We have received refunds for, I'm sorry, what does liquidation mean actually?
Yeah. So liquidation is just the process where customs goes through an audit and review. So they're looking at your valuation, they're looking at country of origin, they're looking at your harmonized tariff schedule, your classification. And so when you're submitting a refund in CAPE, you're actually there's a ticker that you're checking off that says like, I attest that everything is correct, that my classifications are right, my country of origin declarations, all the things. And what so many are doing is they're like treating that like when you're signing up to buy something from your new favorite retailer, and they're just like, check. I just want to buy my new t-shirt. And don't go so fast, slow down. Our recommendation is you need to audit first, and you could do this in phases, right? So submit your first clean batch with like your cleanest entries first. Then anything that has gaps, remedy that, and then go do a second batch and a third batch. There's no need to just because it's called CAPE under consolidation, there's no need to consolidate the whole thing in one
That's a
claim.
great point, because once it gets flagged, the whole claim goes to the back of the
Right.
bus, right?
All those entries
Yep.
go into liquidation. Typically, every entry typically Customs has 314 days from the date of release to liquidate. So, typically they're doing this. That's why a lot of importers 6, 7, 8 months after they've imported something, Customs comes back to them and starts asking them questions because they're going through the liquidation process.
I think we have time for this. It's like a two-part. So if the tariff was paid by my broker to Customs and then I paid my broker, who is due the refund? So it's the importer of record, obviously, Nunzio. But can you just explain, is it that they need to go into ACE and update their ACH information?
So yeah, a couple of good points here. One, it's always the importer of record who is entitled to that refund. But something that just came up recently that we started seeing, there's a form called a 4811, which can designate where refunds go on the entry level. And that's if you're a foreign importer of record and you're claiming a refund, you have to do that. But in many cases, even U.S. importers had 4811, so you might see monies being sent back to the broker, which is why it's really important to run those two reports that we had up before, the 613 and 603 rev reports, because it'll show you monies that have been paid. And if it's not in your account, that means it's in someone else's account. So you have to kind of look to see where to go after that.
Got it. One last one. How do we know if we had errors, and how can we tell when the funds are going to be paid out?
Yeah, so typically the errors come back pretty quick. In the CAPE rejection, you'll see if there's a certain amount of entries that became rejected. When they've gone through the process, in the liquidation, you'll actually see liquidated, IEEPA tariffs removed, the amounts that were removed, plus the interest. So it all comes up in liquidation reports, which is available to all importers under ACE.
One more, Nunes. How do you file a protest? I saw it just come up.
Oh yeah. So
who do you file it with?
Yeah, so the protest is basically in a letter format. And as I said, you would either do it yourself as an importer or go through like a licensed customs broker or a trade attorney, and then you just have to kind of bring up the facts of like, what are you protesting? In this case specifically, what you're asking is, because this case is still out there, you're basically saying, I do not want these entries to go into final liquidation because we're waiting for the results of the IEEPA tariffs in their final status. But we're happy to help with any. If anyone wants more details, please reach out.
Yeah, I can't thank you guys enough. This was awesome. Don't go to ChatGPT. Go to these guys. They know their stuff. They're here to help. We're gonna do this again. We will, stay on top of this, and I guess stay tuned, right?
Yeah, and connect with us on LinkedIn. I talk about tariffs just about every single day and everything else there. So you can get latest updates if you connect with us. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, SAX.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, of course.